He's made clear he believes the US is a legitimate target.
They are the spearhead that has killed the people of this religion. Every effort that is made against America and the Jews yields positive and great direct results. He who can kill an American soldier, this is much better for him than expending his efforts on other matters.
Last October, those words of Mr. bin Laden seemed to have been acted upon when terrorists blew themselves up in a boat alongside an American warship, the USS Cole, in the port of Aden in the Yemen. 17 sailors were killed and 38 injured. The inquiry into the bombing is still going on. Mr. bin Laden has never claimed responsibility for this and other terror attacks, but Washington is convinced that he has backed and encouraged groups of Islamic fundamentalists with grievances against America.
He always deliberately maintained his distance from terrorist attacks. When you look at Osama bin Laden and his network, his financial network, it's rather like peeling an onion, skin by skin.
But perhaps the strongest indication that Osama bin Laden may be behind today's terror attacks is the involvement of his organization in the bombing of the World Trade Center 8 years ago. 6 people died in that explosion, which did limited damage to the building. When the master bomber, Ramzi Youssef, was caught, he was found to have names in his notebook which matched people in Osama bin Laden's terror network.
We knew at the time that Ramzi Youssef and his associates had outside support. They had to have finance, logistical, training, and other types of support. And now it appears very likely that the bin Laden network was the ultimate supporter of that operation and the planned follow-up operations.
Jane Corbin, well, I've been joined by a number of other guests I'll introduce in just a moment, but Jane Corbin, on the bin Laden connection, it's always very dangerous to leap to a conclusion within hours of something happening, but is there something in what happened today that makes you think that he's the likeliest suspect?
Well, as you saw in that report, his followers were believed to be behind the World Trade Center bombing 8 years ago. And the investigators told us that they actually found a lot of evidence to suggest that those bombers were planning a much bigger attack on New York to paralyze it in effect by targeting tunnels, railway lines and bridges. And perhaps most significantly of all, 11 planes, it was planned, would be hijacked and blown up on the ground. Now, you know, I think one has to realize that that was obviously going to be a very big operation. They didn't succeed in it, and what we've seen today has involved a lot of planes in a series of explosions, and I think a lot of people will draw some parallels between perhaps a failed attempt 8 years ago and replanning for today.
And are you surprised, if it is him, that it was possible to do this without any intelligence apparently leaking, or were there signs that something was afoot?
There were signs coming from papers in the Arab region about 3 weeks ago that he had said to followers that he was going to have a big push against America, that a big attack was in the offing. And certainly intelligence agencies in a number of countries were warning people of this. So there seems to have been some indication that something was in the offing. And of course the thing about Osama bin Laden is it's very difficult to pin him down with his connections to myriads of groups, because of the way he operates, which is to give backing, encouragement, but to stay back from the operation, while very small groups allied to a number of causes and a number of grievances actually go out and do the bombing.
Well, if this is the correct explanation of what happened, what is his motivation? What's behind it? What's he trying to do?
He became involved in Afghanistan, where he lives now, when the original Afghan freedom fighters, the so-called Mujahideen, were fighting against the Soviet invasion. He's a Saudi, and when the Americans came into Saudi in the operation to liberate Kuwait from Iraqi control, Osama bin Laden was enraged by this. I think he saw it as a form of imperialism, and since that day he declared war on America. So the motivation is quite hard to pin down, but there seems to be a great anger at the root of it against America and of course against Israel, where of course it finds a ready response in a number of Arab countries, and has done in recent months, where we've seen an upsurge of violence in the Middle East.
America's tried previously to find him and kill him. Is there any hope they can catch him, or is he so well concealed in Afghanistan or wherever he is that won't prove possible?
Well, of course, after the Nairobi bombing, they did bomb a number of his training camps in Afghanistan. They failed to get him. He's under the protection of the Taliban, who have resolutely refused to give him up. He is obviously a fugitive who lives in this way. It's not going to be easy.
Jane, thanks very much. Let's join Jane Stanley now, who's in New York this afternoon. Jane, good afternoon. We can see the smoke still billowing out behind you. Has the mood changed in New York in these 7 hours?
I don't think it has really. It went from a very early disbelief as these events unfolded live on American television screens. People saying, oh, this is like a movie. I couldn't believe that this would happen. And I think then to utter horror as the Twin Towers collapsed. And the only change really, I think, has been a deepening of the sickness that people feel here, a deepening of the fear, because as we can see with the smoke still billowing out of the World Trade Center and the horror that lies underneath that rubble, people are very frightened about what is going to be found there, because we still have no idea of fatalities. On casualties, we know 600 people are in the city's hospitals and 1,500 more are being treated at a tent hospital set up in Liberty Island Park out in the Bay of New York. But still, no way of coming to terms with something like this.
Are the rescue services at work on the site, on the rubble of those two huge buildings, or is it a place it's impossible to conceive anybody could remain alive underneath?
It's hard to know, because behind me, where the Twin Towers are, just beyond that, the mayor of New York, Rudolph Giuliani, has actually closed down the majority of the city. He's just forced a line, and everyone else has been evacuated out. We see behind us regularly coming ambulances, sirens wailing of people. We really have no idea who's being taken from the scene. But of course, rescue efforts are still going on. But when you think of 110 stories, 2 towers falling down, it's a huge area that will have been devastated, very hard to get at. And of course the city, the Red Cross here, appealing for blood donors, people being treated for burns. But kind of as the downtown area, the financial area of Manhattan behind me has been closed down, in many ways so has the information network. For example, we're hearing nothing at all on fatalities. Perhaps it's too horrible for the authorities here to even contemplate yet.
Jane, thank you very much. We know perhaps slightly less about what happened in Washington at the Pentagon building, where a plane also crashed into the side of the building there. And of course, as in Manhattan, many people already at work. People go to work at 7:30 in the morning, and it was already 9 o'clock before this plane crash happened. And then the fourth plane, which one congressman has said may have been on its way to Camp David when it crashed, though we don't know anything about that. But Tom Carver is in Washington and has just been to a Pentagon briefing. Can you throw more light on what actually happened at the Pentagon as a result of that crash, Tom?
Actually, in fact, it was a White House briefing. So let me just tell you what President Bush's movements are at the moment. He is at an Air Force base, a remote Air Force base in Nebraska, and within the next hour, he is going to be convening his National Security Council by phone. We understand that Dick Cheney will be heading the National Security Council meeting in the Situation Room in the White House just behind me here. That's basically the war room underneath the White House. With him is Condoleezza Rice, the National Security Advisor, and the Secretary of Transportation. Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, will be at the Pentagon and also obviously taking part. And they will essentially be assessing the situation, trying to diagnose who carried out these attacks and what the response is going to be. Karen Hughes was the White House spokeswoman, and I believe we may have a short piece of video of her.
Every federal agency has implemented continuity of operations plans to make sure the government continues to function effectively. While the markets closed today because of the situation in Manhattan, the United States financial system has continued to operate. Banks have been open all day. The Federal Reserve has operated regularly and continuously. The Department of Health and Human Services has mobilized medical personnel and supplies to provide help to local authorities who are working so diligently to respond and try to help the victims of these terrible attacks. President Bush has committed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to identify and bring to swift justice those responsible for these despicable attacks.
Tom, what news do you have about what actually happened to the Pentagon building itself and what the scale of the casualties there were?
What happened, as we understand it, as eyewitnesses describe it, is that an American Airlines plane came in at an incredibly steep descent and hit the ground floor of the Pentagon on one of the wings. It completely destroyed the side of the Pentagon, all 6 stories of it, and as far as we know, is still completely embedded in it. The last I saw of the Pentagon, and there is smoke still rising, I don't know if you can see it over my shoulder, but the Pentagon is in the distance, smoke is still coming out of it. There are obviously a lot of casualties there, but the only small bright spot is that in fact it was an area of the Pentagon that had just been renovated, and a number of the offices were empty at the time. The Chief of the Naval Staff, Chief of Naval Operations, we understand, had his office there. That's a 3-star general. He, in fact, is okay, I've been told, but obviously a number of very senior and high-ranking, mainly naval officials, appear to have been in that part of the Pentagon, and their fate at the moment is unknown.
How long after the New York attack was the Washington attack, Tom? And there was some talk about the Pentagon being evacuated earlier today, but clearly it wasn't evacuated by the time the plane struck.
That's right. The call for evacuation went out a few minutes before the plane struck, apparently in response to the World Trade Center attacks, which happened about 20 minutes before. They were in the process of beginning that evacuation when the plane struck the Pentagon, so they hadn't begun it. Obviously, the evacuation happened immediately afterwards, and the Pentagon, at the moment, except for emergency personnel, such as the Secretary of Defense, remains completely empty at this stage. There's a lot of speculation here in Washington, obviously, that the 3 attacks were well coordinated, and I should say that the mood on Congress is also very grim. The whole of Congress has been evacuated. A number of senior congressional figures are calling this America's Pearl Harbor. It's a very grim day up on Capitol Hill, and they are trying to establish an air of calm, but it doesn't look good when the actual seat of government itself in Washington at the moment is empty.
Tom, thank you very much. Well, I'm joined here in the studio now by Ehud Barak, who until earlier this year was the Prime Minister of Israel, by James Rubin, who was President Clinton's Assistant Secretary of State, and by Rosemary Hollis of the Royal Institute of International Affairs. Mr. Barak, first of all, should we see this as an act designed to draw attention to what is happening in the Middle East, or should we see it as something quite separate from that?
It's clear that the whole Western civilization is at war with world terror. It might have some kind of indirect relationship to something that happened either in Afghanistan or somewhere else in the Middle East, but this is not the case. Once they are ready to hit the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, it means that we are basically at war. And I'm fully confident American people, which is a tough and courageous people, and have tough leadership at the helmet, they will know how to fight back. And I believe that leaders all around the world, here in the UK, in Europe, in Russia, the Russians will fully cooperate with this. Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Israel, of course, and others should join hands to defeat terror, period. We cannot afford this kind of threat to our whole way of life.
I'll come back to that point in a moment. I want to bring in Frank Gaffney, who's the director of the Center for Security Policy, who's in Washington. How do you think the United States will respond to this? And are you surprised, as an expert in security matters, that nobody had any inkling of what happened?
Well, to answer the second question first, I'm not frankly surprised because this is precisely the way the the cells that we're up against here, and perhaps their state sponsors, are organizing themselves and conducting their activities. It is purposely designed to keep the lowest possible profiles, avoid signatures, as they say in the intelligence business, and conduct their affairs in such a way that we won't know what's happened to us until it has happened. As to how the United States will respond, it remains to be seen, of course. My hope is that, as any number of people have said on this program and elsewhere here in Washington in recent hours, the United States is at war now. And I hope that the President will respond appropriately and accordingly. This is not a matter for business as usual, a judicial process, forensic investigations, and so on. I believe that we have been struck in a way that is probably going to be a precursor to even worse. And it is time for us to act as I think our friends in Israel have been doing for some time, quite correctly, which is to use such intelligence as we do have, to use such force as we have at our disposal to strike at and try to destroy these terrorists and their sponsors before they strike again.
But do you know who they are?
We probably won't know, if at all, for some time with precision who is responsible for this precise attack. Therefore, I would go after everyone who is engaged in terrorist acts against us, everyone who has made known their determination to do harm to the United States. I think we ought to use this as an opportunity, as has been pointed out by others, to put them on the run. Let them know that they've got no place to hide, and such places that they hide are going to be very difficult places from which to operate against us.
We heard earlier on that the United States security in airports was rather lax because there was a feeling that this was the kind of thing that couldn't happen. There have obviously been terrorist incidents in the United States, but compared with the way that terrorism is expected in Europe and in the Middle East, in the United States it's not thought likely. Has this been, in that sense, a big shock? And will the scales fall from America's eyes about their vulnerability after this?
Well, I hope the scales are falling from our eyes as a people about our vulnerability in the largest sense. We are, in fact, a target for others' enmity, and they are using the means they have to, and they apparently are going to be a larger and larger set of means with ever more deadly possible effects, including, I have to tell you, missiles that are, I'm afraid, being acquired by some of the same states, some of the sponsors of terrorism, and perhaps even some of the organizations that we're worrying about today. Vulnerability is something this country can no longer afford, either to missiles or to these other kinds of terrorism. Clearly, security at the airports in this country has to be improved. It's been said that some of the employees currently engaged in doing these security searches have actually been wooed away by the fast food industry, which tells you something about the quality and the pay scales that we've been giving to people doing this job. That probably will end, I hope.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kafney-Bolt. James Rubin, you heard what Ehud Barak said a moment ago about the nature of this terrorism and it being everybody's enemy. If there were peace in the Middle East, would this have happened?
Well, I think the short answer is yes. During the time when Prime Minister Barak was in office, or even before him, when the peace process was fairly optimistic, people thought the Oslo process was working. 1993 was the time when the Oslo process was at its highest, and in 95 and 96, when we had great optimism between Israel and the Palestinians, Osama bin Laden was attacking the United States and attacking American interests. He's not interested in peace in the Middle East. He's interested in destroying what is the civilized world. And so I think we shouldn't get our apples and our oranges mixed up. Osama bin Laden is not doing this for the Palestinians. When the Palestinians and the Israelis were closest to peace, Osama bin Laden was still going about his dirty business.
So how do you see this as a one-man campaign, obsession with the destruction of America? I mean, it almost beggars belief that one person can get this kind of, without any other rhyme or reason, can get this scale of operation to go, and people to commit suicide themselves in order to achieve his ends.
Well, clearly, when we say Osama bin Laden, we need to think a little bit larger than that. What we're talking about is a loose group of organizations funded throughout the Arab world and other parts of the Muslim world who have seen Osama bin Laden as a figurehead, but these are all people who reject the Western civilized way of life. These are people who believe that the United States is the root of evil. And when you see an attack on the symbol of civilization in Europe, in all the world, which is the World Trade Center, it's not the Pentagon. All the people of the world operate through the World Trade Center. They're going to be Japanese, they're going to be Africans, they're going to be Latin Americans, they're going to be Europeans who are in there working today, who are going to be dead because of Osama bin Laden. He's attacking all the civilized world, and what he's about is being opposed to civilization. It's not about the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. It's about Western civilization as we've come to know it and love it, and because we believe in freedom, we have a society that is going to always be a little bit lax unless we're going to go to extreme measures, which I don't think we'll ever take.
Do you agree with this?
Well, I think there's a concern here because we're building a case during the course of this program which leans heavily on the verdict that taking it out in retaliation on Osama bin Laden will be the appropriate way to respond. Now, I imagine that means a bombing raid on Afghanistan. What about all those poor Afghans who have nothing to do with Osama bin Laden and who would not be willing supporters of the Taliban government even in Afghanistan if they had any choice? This means, in the terminology of war, collateral damage. This in itself is not resolution of a problem, it's building more hatred and the perception that the United States wields power without compunction. That is something to be aware of.
Okay, Ehud Barak.
I don't think that the collateral damage is the real issue at stake now. Look at the collateral damage, so to speak, that had happened in the United States. We are dealing with a world effort, not necessarily Osama bin Laden himself. We all know the names of rogue states: Iraq, Iran, North Korea, Gaddafi to an extent, maybe one more. We all know the names of rogue leaders and the name of thugs of terror. And their names are known to the MI6, to the CIA, to the BND, the CM Bureau. And there is a need for joint effort, diplomatic, economic, intelligence-wise, and operation-wise, the same way that our ancestors fought against the piracy on the high seas. No airport and no port terrorists should be allowed to land, and whoever hosts them or directly or indirectly support them should be automatically isolated from the community and family of nations. This is the only way. Without this clarity of purpose, there will be no world order possible, period.
Well, we're talking about declaring war, and you're talking about doing it in protection of democracy, and you're talking about sacrificing some of that democracy in the prosecution of that war.
Weapons these days are accurate enough. It's not a matter. I don't want to go into the operational details. Once there is a will, a clear will of world leadership to put an end to it, it will take a lot of painful moments, ups and downs, and even tough moments like this one, but we will prevail and democracies will overcome this phenomena of terror within 10 years.
Okay, let's pause there and go back to Tom Carver, who we were hearing from a moment ago, who's been in Washington all day, and here's his report on the latest events there.
The American Airlines plane slammed into the ground floor of the Pentagon. It was less than an hour after the World Trade Center attack. All 6 stories of the building on one side were destroyed, leaving a massive hole in the military headquarters of the world's superpower. Stunned 3-star generals and clerks were herded into surrounding car parks, which were turned into emergency medical centers. The Air Force was activated to shoot down any other plane which came close. This is the first attack on the Pentagon in American history.
You could tell it was like a suicide bomber. But I'm not saying there was a bomb, but, you know, it was a plane. And it just came, it came streaking down and it hit short. It didn't go into the top of the Pentagon. It came like in short, and then everything sprayed up, like a fireball sprayed up on the wall.
A quarter of an hour later, a 757 crashed into a field close to Camp David, the president's rural retreat. The president himself was hundreds of miles away in Florida, about to talk to some school children, when his chief of staff, Andrew Card, whispered the news to him. Minutes later, he was boarding Air Force One. Instead of returning to Washington, he went to an Air Force base in Louisiana.
Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts. I've been in regular contact with the Vice President, Secretary of Defense, the National Security Team, and my cabinet. We have taken all appropriate security precautions to protect the American people.
Washington itself has been virtually sealed off from the outside world. Every federal office has been closed, thousands of workers sent home. Even Congress has been evacuated and shut.
It's another Pearl Harbor for this country. And I gathered my staff and we calmly held a prayer meeting, and then I told them to go home.
Across the country, banks and schools have been ordered to close. Inner cities are deserted. Many parts of the country have declared states of emergency. There is no air traffic over America at present. All planes have been ordered to land at the nearest airport.
A nationwide appeal for blood has gone out. In several cities, the phone networks have been frozen. Here on the eastern seaboard, the motorways are clogged with traffic. If it was the terrorists' intention to sow confusion and panic in America, at least on this day, it would seem they succeeded. Tom Carver, BBC News, Washington.
And now we join Paddy O'Connell again in New York with the latest news of what's happening there. Paddy.
I think, David, what's becoming clear is that this is not over. That is to say, if you look at the pictures of Manhattan, downtown where it happened, the mayor has evacuated part of Lower Manhattan. That will be no surprise. But if you think back a step as to why, it's because buildings remain unstable. This is the scene around the building that collapsed, but the question being asked is what about the buildings that were standing immediately after it? Now, I don't, where I'm sitting in Midtown Manhattan, have an answer to that question, but I'm afraid this question is the one that's preoccupying us, because underneath the rubble is the answer to the question, how many people have lost their lives? We know there are displaced people. We know there are disgusted people all across this country, and here there are people trying to get home. But as I speak to you, David, we don't know the answer to the question of the scale of the human tragedy. The analysis, important as it is, will be had, but the figures on people, we just don't know.
And what sort of flow of information is there? You say nothing is really known, but is everybody, is information still coming out from the World Trade Center down there?
We have an unconfirmed report of a building collapse. At times like this, you want to hear directly from the city authorities. I passed one of the major hospitals 4 hours ago. They were shouting for blood donations in the street. And about half an hour later, many of us were reporting that they were looking for blood across the city. So it's a very much of an immediate return to the most basic way of communicating in a city of this scale. People are confused as much as they are disgusted. People are dead and people don't know about it. So there is a stoicism here, I would say. We would be clinging to the word panic and forgetting that people are getting on with it, clearing it up, and angry. But equally, we are focusing in the attention now on what's under that rubble. And here, the situation on Times Square, I don't know if we can bring you, David, the picture behind me. This was full earlier of people. It's now deserted. This makes me think people are heading home. I'm concluding this because one avenue is shut behind me, 7th Avenue, but this was full of around 500 people 3 hours ago. Where have they gone? We think they've gone home, and we don't know the answer to that either.
And is there a feeling that America will be able to revenge this in some way, or indeed prevent its happening, anything like it happening again? Or are people fatalistic about it?
I think shock has turned to anger already. I heard the first mention of Pearl Harbor I heard was from a man on the street down here. Then we spoke to a foreign policy expert, and you've surrounded by many names that will be familiar around the world, of course. But the person that we were speaking to saying, America will respond to a moment in time. This is a moment in time. It'll be hard for the president to resist some kind of call for action from the world's richest democracy. The question is, of course, and it's not for me to answer what action that will be, but yes, the word on the street from people I've spoken to is they do want action.
Paddy O'Connor, thank you very much indeed for that report. Well, there have been comparisons between today's events and the impact